Episode 126 of On the Ledge podcast is here. But it's not just On the Ledge this week. I'm collaborating with the Royal Horticultural Society, no less. In an absolute first for both On the Ledge and the RHS podcast, we've done a joint episode which will be going out on both feeds. I'm joined by Matthew Pottage, who is the curator of the famous RHS garden Wisley in Surrey in the UK, and also a massive houseplant fan, and Anne Swithinbank, who was a guest in my Cactus World live show and one of my houseplant heroes. We talk about everything from where our houseplant careers began to the weird and wonderful things we grow in our homes. And we delve into our houseplant dreams. That's coming up shortly, but first, a small amount of housekeeping. Shout outs to Amanda and Jade, who became legends this week by joining my clan of patrons, and to Brennan, who became a superfan. Thanks to you, you're a trio of loveliness. Thanks also to Alison and Jade's a Gem, who left lovely reviews for On the Ledge. Jade's a Gem says they're enjoying the show because it's nice to have somewhere to go where others are just as passionate about plants as I am. Brackets, for some reason I've not found anyone that wants to obsessively discuss plants all day with me. I know, what the heck is that about? But anyway, that's what On the Ledge is here for, to give you that outlet. So thanks very much for those lovely reviews. And if you haven't left a review for On the Ledge yet, I hope you're feeling a slightly guilty feeling right now. So crack on and get it done. And thanks to Caitlin from Edinburgh, who got in touch about my episode with Maya Thomas. That was number 124. And Caitlin says they were filled with absolute joy by my description of plant glasses. Caitlin writes, my mum's an incredible plant person, but I never had the bug growing up. She would always point out plants on walks or round the garden, and I would always roll my eyes in boredom. That is until earlier this year when I unexpectedly fell in love with houseplants. Now I see the world so differently. Listening to your podcast and learning so much allowed me to develop my own plant glasses, and these days I'm obsessed. My plant glasses let me see plants and learn more about them everywhere I go. Well, I think it can't be long before a chain of opticians gets me into design plant glasses. How cool would that be? What would they be like? Would they be shaped like monstera leaves? I don't know. But yeah, I'll start working on a design, I think. Enough making a spectacle of myself. It's time to hear from Matthew Pottage and Anne Swithinbank. We get through a lot of plant names in this, so as always, check out the show notes at janeperrone.com if you want to get the whole picture of the plants we're talking about. Okay, are you ready? Let's go.
So welcome to the RHS Gardening Podcast Houseplant Special. My name's Matthew Pottage and I'm the curator of RHS Garden Wisley, and I absolutely love houseplants. I think I've mentioned them a few times on here before. And for a very, very special one-off episode, I'm joined by, I want to call them the queens of houseplants. So Anne Swithinbank from Gardener's Question Time and Jane Perrone from On the Ledge. And we're going to have a bit of a geek out talking about houseplants. So yeah, this is the first of its kind. I'm going to call it a podcast swap. Jane, over to you first. Can you explain to us about On the Ledge and how that's going to merge with the RHS podcast today?
Well, it's a wonderful opportunity to have our listeners listen to another podcast. And my podcast is a weekly podcast about houseplants that I've been making since February 2017. And it's basically just my excuse to talk about houseplants because nobody else in my family is interested in hearing me.
You've got to talk to somebody.
So I just decided to start a podcast to provide an outlet for my conversations, and also just as a way of being able to email somebody and say, do you want to have a chat with me about Gesneriads, and actually have a reason to do it, which is putting it out on the podcast. So it's just a personal passion that's turned into a bit of an ongoing thing, and I have great fun making it. And it's also become a really nice community of listeners around the world, which is great.
It's really, really good. And then Anne, I mean, I see you as a bit of there's a current trend in houseplants right now, but I mean, you're stalwart and a kind of a real champion of houseplants for, I want to say for years, but you're now pulling faces at me because I'm borderline here. But
well,
tens of years.
It is years. Because I started to grow them when I was very young, and obviously I think I sort of became known as Houseplant Lady, didn't I? Because of being at Wisley, looking after the previous glasshouses, as glasshouse supervisor, and then subsequently going on to Gardener's World when Jeff Hamilton was the presenter, and going up to Rutland where he lived. He really wasn't interested in houseplants, so he was really, really happy for me to take that over. And I guess that's where I really got the sort of title of Houseplant Lady or Houseplant Queen.
So we are going to start our bit of a journey into houseplants. I asked you to do some homework, and I can see you've absolutely followed the request. We've got some beautiful bits of plant material on the table and some very nice photographs on here. So can you tell me, or can we talk a bit about a plant that inspired your interest into indoor plants? Hopefully we'll see some images of it, or
I haven't got an image of my one because this is just in my brain. But the one that I wanted to talk about was in my doctor's surgery as a kid. And I don't know if you remember, there used to be, this is way back, and you used to have those coloured lights, and it would your light would, for your doctor, would light up, and it would go, and then you'd be called in, you put your number up. And right next to that was this huge Swiss cheese plant, the Monstera deliciosa, which is so trendy now. But this was like back in the day. This was late 1970s, and it was just huge, and it was going everywhere, and there were aerial roots all over the place. And I don't think it probably got watered or repotted more than once in a blue moon. But I just remember sitting there waiting for my doctor's appointment, just looking at this plant and going, what is it? What the hell is that? Where's that come from? Why is that in here? And that sparked fascination for me. And it took me quite a few years to get my first Swiss cheese plant, but it was something that sparked off that interest in indoor plants.
And they seem to, I mean, you do see them around in waiting rooms. I remember one in the old hospital foyer in my hometown. And because they, would normally grow up trees and be scaling up any kind of structure, they don't need massive pots, do they? So they can get enormous plants with a small pot, roots everywhere. And as long as they've got like a corner to lean up to or something, they just keep going. And if they've got the ceiling room, the leaves get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and I do wonder with a lot of people who are buying these plants now, and they're buying them as dinky little, 2 foot tall, have any conception of what they're letting themselves in for if they have this plant long term, because they can get monstrously large, which is wonderful. They're fantastic plants.
And that's what's great about plants, though, isn't it? You get the small cutting, or you get the small plant that's just come in fresh, and it's the character that it forms as it grows older that really fascinates me.
Yeah, and they get so characterful. But how about you, Anne? What was your early memory or inspired houseplant?
Back in the 60s, when I started to collect houseplants, that does make me sound very old, doesn't it? Most of them came to me as small pieces of succulents, cacti, pelargoniums, busy lizzies from other people's windowsills, or they would hand me plants that they had bought and had nearly died. And that's how all my plants came to me. So I've brought along a picture of the candle cactus.
Yeah.
And you can see why it's called the candle cactus, because it's sort of got all these candle-like sections. It's a plant I still keep now. It's not a very pretty plant. It grows in the winter. And my family absolutely love the plant we have, and they always get it down at Christmas time from my windowsill because it's very celebratory. It produces little flowers on long stalks that are like groundsel, and they turn into dandelions. And Samantha, who is nearly 30, says to me, "We need to get the dandelion plant down." I love it. It looks like it's waving its dandelions. And so it's like a Christmas decoration that has to come down in the middle of winter and joins us, in the sitting room for a few weeks, and then it has to go back upstairs again. So I still grow it. But that, to me, it takes me right back. Things like the Mexican hat plant. They were the sorts of things that circulated because we didn't have many places to go and buy them. In a funny sort of way, garden centres en masse hadn't been invented back then. It was florist shops and people's private collections. Yeah.
So trying to cast my mind back to early memory, I spent a lot of time with my grandma, who had a big collection of pelargoniums. And I was never, as a kid, that taken by lots of smelly leaves and all the red and pink flowers. She grew them for the flowers, and they just weren't very appealing to me. But I do remember this high up shelf in her greenhouse with these cacti on. And there was one cacti that I particularly was drawn to that I thought looked completely different from all the others. And eventually, years down the line, when she passed away, I managed to get hold of this cactus, which I identified as Ferrocactus emery eye. And it always reminded me of her. It wasn't in a very good state. It was nearly brown all the way up. And eventually I lost it. I was still quite a young kid at the time. But then I came across one a few years ago in a garden centre. It was just in a mixed cactus tray. I was so delighted to see it again. And I thought, I will have that for my office windowsill at work, because it was Grandma that got me into plants, and that will just be a little bit of, my childhood memory. So I wasn't going to bring it in on the tube because it's quite a fierce thing. But there's an image of it. I'm sure you've seen them before. But that lovely red spine and quite a bluey grey body to it. I prefer succulents to cacti, and I'm not into cacti that have loads and loads of masses of smaller spines, but something like that with the big fat red spines that are quite sparse. I don't know, I just find that quite visually
striking,
appealing.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you only need to walk into it a couple of times, and I mean, my mum would never have wanted it in the house when I was younger, the grandma's one, because, up north people have net curtains everywhere. It caused terrible problems with the nets. It'd be stuck on everything. So, but, down south it's fine because net curtains are illegal. So it sits very happily on the windowsill and looks quite cool.
Talking about pelargoniums, though, I have brought a couple of bits because these are the ones that I make my famous pelargonium cake from. And I've got
and
crispum.
That is a nice one.
This is the easiest to accommodate, isn't it? Because here we have crispum variegatum, which has tiny little leaves, and it's lemon scented and quite dainty, really.
It's really dainty, isn't it? And I think if somebody saw that, they'd almost think that's not a pelargonium, right? Because it is different.
And what we do is crystallise the leaves and use them on top of the cake as decoration.
That sounds very
But the one that makes the scent, or if you like, the flavour inside the cake is radula. And that's this one that's really kind of rose. And so you can put that in the sugar, and you can put that in the flour, and you can bake the leaf into the cake and take it out before you ice it.
Great. And of course really the cake's just in your bag down there for us to try.
Sometimes I do that, but I haven't done it this time. Sorry.
I look forward to sampling it. It sounds very, very good. So houseplants have really undergone a resurgence in popularity of late. Was your interest always fashionable? I'm looking over to you, Anne. I guess in the 60s when you started, was it? Everybody?
No, I was considered very odd for a small child, and then a sort of growing up teenager to be interested in plants, and a school-age child was considered very eccentric.
Yeah.
And I was interested in horses as well and all the natural world. And everybody said to my mother, "Oh, she'll grow out of it, don't worry. When she grows up, she'll be into boys and fashion and, music, and she'll grow out of it." But I never did, of course. It just got worse. I just collected more and more and more. You can do all the other stuff as well, but you've got to keep your plants going.
Of course.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was that awful slump, wasn't there? Somewhere in the middle of the 1990s, and certainly by the time we had ground force, everybody was suddenly looking at their little gardens and outdoor rooms, and got very involved in creating them instantly and buying trendy plants in pots and putting them in their gardens. And they seem to forget about the indoor plants. Yeah. But I think if you're fascinated by the plants themselves and their characters and their origins, you'll never lose it. If you're using them to decorate your house, then it could come in and out of fashion. Yeah, but if they are a real obsession, which the three of us can understand very well, then I think it will always be with you. It won't leave you.
And I'd like to think that all those that have been bitten by the bug at the moment, I mean, there will, as you say, there'll be a percentage that will move on, but there'll also be a percentage that I think actually become quite attached to their plants. And once you've had a plant for more, I think, than a few years, it really becomes part of the furniture, part of the house, and you see it flower and you see it grow, and then it just becomes something that you don't just chuck out like a bunch of flowers. How about you, Jane?
Well, like Anne, I was into plants from a very young age. I guess, quite luckily for me, the slump in houseplants in the 90s coincided with me being at university and then doing a master's degree in the US. So that was a time when I didn't really have many plants anyway, because I was moving around and not in a permanent residence. Although there is a hilarious picture of me as a student, which I don't remember at all, but a picture of me with my housemates. And we all got spider plants on our heads. So there must have been some plants in the house at some point. But then as soon as I got my own place and started to become more settled, then yes, the plants immediately came back in again. And in the last few years, I've just got more and more as things have been easier to get hold of, apart from anything else. As a child, I mean, I used to buy a lot of plants, be given a lot of plants, also jumble sales, got a lot of plants from jumble sales, and added to my collection that way. And obviously now it's got a lot more upscale. We've got sort of boutiques opening in every town and city selling house plants. But I also got into trying to grow houseplants from seed, which is great fun as well. And I try to sort of do that on the podcast every year and encourage people to give that a try, because that's a really interesting experiment to get to know plants better.
Yeah, I can imagine. And just casting our minds back to when things weren't so fashionable, I agree. You kind of went anywhere where there may be houseplants and you kind of be looking for something slightly more unusual or different. And then you'd always have like a few staples. There'd always be a Howie, a palm and a yucca and a rubber plant. But then now, because there is so much fashion and so much spend clearly in the houseplant sector, almost any good nursery you go into, there's all manner of things. I mean, every time I go into the Wisley Plant Centre, there's another new mother-in-law's tongue that I've not seen and I don't have, and I just thought, okay, I can't keep collecting these because I could just fill every office room, in the building I'm in at Wisley and my own house with mother-in-law's tongues now, and it's just more and more appearing, and it's exciting, but at the same time, it's like, wow, this is actually, you can be absolutely inundated.
And, that fleshy succulent plants, I can see why they're very attractive, and I'm always banging on it, and you've got it. I mean, this is why I'm looking at you very annoyed in a very annoyed way.
I've got a photo
Bantel
of it.
Sensation, and you've got a photo of it,
and
you're going to torture me with this. This is the snake plant, the Sansevieria Bantel Sensation, which is impossible to get apart from stealing it from Matthew Pottage. It's impossible to get in the UK. The nearest I've seen is an online shop in Poland's got some. It's very common in the US. It's this very thin-leaved snake plant with silvery markings and stripes, and it's very attractive. I mean, Matthew, perhaps you can tell us more. You've got one. But I love this plant.
It's really cool, and I do like it because of the pure white variegation. And there's some areas where it produces just all areas of white, and you do get a bit of dead tissue, as you can see there, but generally it's a really nice, well-behaved.
When are we getting some in the Wisley Plant Centre for me to come and buy?
Yeah, I know, and everyone's going to be asking them after this as well.
I know,
and the buyer won't be thanking me. It's really, really slow. I mean, I got this years ago. I used to go to the Woking Cacti and Succulent Society meetings. Of course I did, on a Saturday night. And it was in the raffle, and there was a lady there that was into her Sansevierias, and it was just a small piece. And you know what? That's why I picked up quite a few unusual succulents, where now people say to me, where would I get that? And I literally don't have an answer. But
the British Cactus and Succulent
Society. Well, exactly.
I mean, a good starting point.
Wouldn't it just? Because, I mean, that is where you have a lot of specialist collections, and those people are normally very generous. And, sometimes something might be rare, but it might not always be slow growing like this particular Sansevieria. Sometimes once you've got something, it bulks up quite quick, and then you're happy to share it around, but it's just not about much. So, those kind of specialist clubs are brilliant for material sharing.
It's interesting with that Bantel Sensation, because this is another plant that was fashionable in the 70s. Snake plants was very.
Yeah, they were.
And when I went to a tour of some Dutch nursery glasshouses, there was a Sansevieria grower and they had one specimen of that. And I said, can I have it, please? And they're like, no. And I said, well, what happened to all this plant material? And they said, well, as these plants faded in popularity, snake plants and Sansevierias became less popular, all this plant material was kind of lost, apart from a few people who were kind of still keeping the faith. And they're the ones now who've got this amazing resource, which is in demand.
Just talk with, we mentioned about fashions on the snake plant or the Sansevieria being massive in the 70s. Just trying to map out some of the fashion moments with houseplants over the last few decades. So Sansevierias were massive. Rubber plants seemed to be quite big then, didn't they?
They were, and a variety of ficus. The weeping fig was too.
Oh, yeah.
And variegated forms of the rubber plants. But then also things like the banyan, Ficus bengalensis, that used to crop up, especially in Parks Department nurseries.
Really?
And of course they grow, all of them grow into huge trees in the wild. They want to get big, but they're quite happy to stay in pots too. And we used to have great fun air layering them for people. I remember on Gardeners World going to the house of someone who, I think they'd written into me when I used to write for the News of the World. And they'd said, our house is being overtaken by this massive rubber plant and we love it and we don't know what to do. Can we prune it? Help. And so we went along with the cameras and I decided to air layer it for them. So I was tracing the stem tips back by about 18 inches or so and then making a cut to damage the stem, putting some sphagnum moss in there, I think it was in those days, but you could use moist compost and just a little bag around it, tied at each side. So it had its own little rooting medium sort of at the right part of the plant. And so we said, well, we'll do several of these and we'll just leave it and we'll come back in about 2 months and hopefully roots will have formed. And in the meantime, if you could just squirt a little bit of water in the bag to make sure it doesn't dry out. And so I went back, they'd all rooted. And so we cut them off and we potted them and we gave them 3 or 4 youngsters that had all rooted beautifully. Lovely story. And then I said, right, now you have these young ones, you must grow them on. And then you can keep one of them when it's really growing strongly, give the others away, and then use it to replace your old big plant. And I looked at their faces and I thought, they're not going to do it. They're just going to grow these as well. And I've just compounded their problem.
Oh my God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I should imagine that, somewhere in the Midlands there's this house that's been totally, there'll be little husks of people inside covered.
The strangler thing.
Yeah.
You needed to go back in another 2 months' time when they went
to
there
supervise.
and saw the old one off at pot level and throw it out on the compost.
And I think this is what people often don't get. It is the same plant. It's the same clone. It is exactly the same plant. When these big things get too big, you can propagate them, you can prune them, and it's fine. You can do it.
And I also think when you have a lot of houseplants at home, you don't always want it to be the dead and dying museum or the hospital windowsill. And I must admit, I'm quite ruthless. If something doesn't look great, or I think, this just really isn't doing it for me anymore, or it's got red spider mite, I don't fiddle around and have a special hospital corner. I do just throw things on the compost heap, because I'm looking at them every day as well. And I want to get enjoyment. I don't want to be I rescued that from outside the shop and that got frosted, and then and this always had this problem with it, or that got knocked off by the dog, but it's going to grow back in 2 years' time. It's just like just enjoy life.
I think it's a British thing that I think on the continent there is more of an attitude like that, but I think in Britain I get people email me in 2 categories. Category 1 is, my plant is a bit poorly, can you help? And you look at the picture and it's a dead stick, and you're like, just throw it away. And then the other one is, your plant's looking amazing and it's got one slightly damaged leaf, and oh my gosh, my plant's going to die. And you're like, well, no, it doesn't always look perfect. You are going to get some yellowing leaves, particularly at the bottom, as long as it's not all the leaves. So there's this kind of double thing that goes on where people hang on to things way beyond where they should, but also panic when normal things that are just part of the cycle of life happen as well.
It's as if you saw these plants growing in the wild, they'd be far from perfect, would they?
Animals
would have taken chunks out of them and things fall on them. They go through droughts, so they're not perfect there.
Okay, so we've done a bit of a trip down memory lane and talked about what was fashionable years ago, but what is your current favourite? What's really exciting you at the moment on your windowsill? Anne, over to you first.
Yes, I'm taking this as a literal question. In other words, it's not exciting me generally, because if I was going to go out with a shopping list, it might be different plants. But just looking around my own collection, what am I really looking at every day and thinking, I love you? I think, first of all, I'm going to go for Cymbidium, and I have a photograph here, one of my Cymbidiums producing its flower buds. And I think this is almost more exciting than when they open. I mean, obviously, the flowers of a Cymbidium orchid are very beautiful, but that moment when they produce the bud to show that they're going to flower, to me, is the most exciting point. They're not the easiest of plants to accommodate because they like fairly cool conditions, so they don't like hot, centrally heated rooms, and they produce quite a lot of tall, grassy foliage, I suppose. Yeah. But you can put them outside for the summer, and in fact, if you let them feel a little bit of chill in the autumn, that is supposed to help them come in and bud up. The secret really is to give them the space in their pot for the pseudobulbs, which are those bulb-like structures at the base that they produce to grow their leaves from, to get a sufficient size to support a flower bud. So a bit of repotting now and again will do that. And then also some liquid feeds, liquid fertiliser in the summer, a bit of high potash to keep them going. And if you do that, they will flower very well for you, and they're very, very easy orchid to grow. And when you have one in flower and you're displaying it, say, on a hall table, your whole house gets sort of transformed. It makes me feel like I live in a sort of palace when I've got a
I know, it feels
Cymbidium.
like some Victorian palace, right? They just have a class about them somehow.
They have a class, that's right.
Yeah.
So there's that.
And if you have a cooler house, it's a great
orchid,
I do. Isn't it?
I can't grow things like caladiums and anthuriums. They just find it too cold. In the night, the temperatures are dropping right down. Our house is a very chilly, badly insulated house, so we tend not to run the heating that much. Yeah. And for cool plants, it's perfect, which is why I've also got a citrus. So I've got a lime.
Nice.
Again,
with quite nice green leaves.
They require not too cold a winter. If you get them too cold, they'll stay alive, but they go so dormant that they don't really grow, and they're very slow to warm up and come into growth, and they have to really start again every year. But by the other side, they don't want to be too hot either. So a normal centrally heated room is probably not for them. They'll get too hot and dry. But if you can get it just right, like the temperature in my office, they will remain healthy if you give them some high nitrogen feed in the summer, a general purpose feed in the winter, just to keep them ticking over. This is a lime, which I find the easiest to grow, the Tahiti lime. Really good, almost always producing flowers, which are scented, or fruits. And then when the fruits are ready, perfect for your gin and tonic.
And I think your feeding regime is interesting there because, how often on GQT do we get, I have an orange, I have a lemon, a lime, and it's got interveinal chlorosis, i.e. the leaves are looking yellow.
Hungry plants.
Yeah, then they're always starved of something, aren't they? And, if I've got any criticism of the citrus plants, it can be they look really miserable if the potting mix isn't right or the feeding regime's not as it should be.
Tap water as well. I think we had a special on it on GQT fairly recently, and it was sort of drummed into us again that if you've got hard tap water, then you probably need ericaceous compost.
Yeah.
If your tap water is quite soft, then a fairly neutral compost will be fine.
Yeah.
So you have to think about that.
Yeah, but looks like a cracking example. And how about you, Jane?
Well, I'm not a great begonia grower. I've killed a lot of begonias over the years, but there is one begonia that has done really well for me and has turned into a bit of a monster, and it's the beefsteak begonia. And I want to get the Latin right here. I think it's Begonia erythrophyllum. It lives up to its name, really. It's got these huge, chunky, succulent leaves. It's a rhizomatous begonia, and it also produces really nice flowers. So right now...
And those rhizomes, the big, thick, creeping stems, are almost at pot level, aren't they?
Exactly. So it's doing its thing now in flower, and the flowers are really quite lovely.
Flowers are enormous. And look at the undersides as well of the leaf.
That's slightly a weird position to photograph it from because I'm kind of looking down on it. But yeah, the flowers are a good 50 centimetres tall. So it's really quite a dramatic plant. The most strangest thing about this, and you can't see at all what it's planted into, but it's planted into a melamine salad bowl with no drainage.
Of course it is.
Now, I am whacking on all the time on my podcast about drainage, but actually there are occasions when things just strangely work without drainage.
I'm a big fan of novel containers, and I never want drainage holes because I don't want to mess up the floor or the furniture. It's just about careful watering.
Yes.
It's just about careful watering. It is, yeah. But that begonia, it's got a lovely glossy dark leaf. The underside is absolutely...
It's bright red.
Pillar box red. It's gorgeous.
Yeah. So it's a really good one. That just came as a little plug plant from Dibley's nursery in North Wales, who are big begonia growers. And as I say, most begonias don't last more than a year with me because I find Rex begonias tricky. But this I find really easy. I think because it likes the fact, because I grow a lot of things, cacti, succulents and Hoyas that I don't water a lot. So I think it likes the fact that it doesn't get too much water.
Yeah,
and with those rhizomes, it's probably just storing its resources in there and relatively happy. So that's probably about 2-3 years old from being a tiny plug plant. So it's been good value.
And of course, if you want to see some of these pictures we're discussing and our plants at home, we will actually be uploading these online so you can have a look. So if you head to rhs.org.uk/podcast, there'll be a link there. And then, of course, to Jane's On the Ledge podcast too. And you can share photos showing off your own stunning indoor displays, swap ideas, or even ask our advice about your poorly or sick plants that are struggling. Thoughts, comments, photos, share them with us via Twitter, or you can join in the conversations on Facebook or Instagram. Find us at _RHS. And if you can tag them #RHS podcast, we'll be able to find your posts even quicker. Right, my current favourite of the moment now. Have either of you ladies seen this before?
Yes, I have. In fact, I saw it yesterday at Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, and we were rushing through this glass house, and I was going, no, I've got to go and see that plant, and we didn't have time. So I can never remember the Latin name. I think it might have changed.
It has. So it's now Hupersia squarosa, but I think it was a Lycopodium before. And club moss is its common name,
moss.
Even though it's not a true moss, but it's known as one of the club mosses. And it's a strange trailing I think I'm attracted to it because I like monkey puzzle trees and it looks a bit conifer-like, but it also looks like a giant moss.
I think it looks like something out of Dr. Seuss, that's something you'd see in a Dr. Seuss book. It's just...
I want one. Do you want one?
I do want one. I've heard it's quite hard though, Matthew. I've heard it's a little bit tricksy.
So I heard that too, and I first saw it in James Wong's living room, actually, up on this shelf, kind of out the way of the window, and I was like, what's that doing there? You just put that there for my visit, because I hear these are a nightmare to grow. And he was like, no, they're really not that hard. Just grow it in like an orchid bark mix. It needs to be quite free draining and it can dry out between waterings. And he was like, no, there's little else to it. And I thought, okay, well, one day if I ever come across one. And then at the Wisley Flower Show, a chap selling air plants had a few of these on his stand. And I just thought, okay, this was meant to be. And 2 years later, in a little hanging pot in my office window, so north-facing window, it's actually above a radiator, which it doesn't seem to be bothered about at all. And I've just put it in an orchid bark mix.
We should warn people, though, that this is quite hard to get hold of. I've had at least 2 listeners who've been contacting me going, where can I get this plant? I can't find it anywhere. And I haven't been able to track it down anywhere. So it's another one that you kind of have to go to a specialist plant show. Or at the moment, I think the Instagram effect is kicking in for this plant. And lots of people are seeking it. The nursery trade isn't able to react immediately to these spikes in demand in a way that perhaps other industries can do a little bit faster.
I think that's what makes it so wonderful when you finally get one, isn't it? When you really wanted it, you find it. Yeah. If it was easy to get one, you could just go down the road. It wouldn't be quite so amazing.
Exactly. And that's...
How would you propagate that then?
No idea. Absolutely no idea. I mean, it looks like something that could maybe root from like a tip cutting. Yeah. But there was a bit of a mangled stem on it when I got it, and I trimmed it back to try and tidy it up, this one stem, and he really didn't like that. It literally died back in a matter of weeks back to the base. So I was like, I won't be doing that again.
So it could be spores then, maybe from spores.
Yeah, well, I guess it would produce that, but also it produces stems right from the base and it's forming like a bit of a crown in the pot. So I guess with an older plant you might be able to split it and divide it as long as you can get roots on it, but it's something that I've not really dared to do anything further with. But I think, if you're at a flower show or plant sale and there's a specialist with epiphytes or air plants, or with it being an epiphytic thing, it's worth a look. So we've got our cool plant selections and things we're into at the moment. How about displaying them and arranging them around the house? Pots on a windowsill. Everyone's been doing that for a long time. I decided to pull out the seat of an old chair and plant up a chair, which I have in my living room. Any oddities you guys have tried or things you've seen that you like, don't like?
I find that I'm going to this deep dive into Instagram, which drives me a little bit nuts, because you see so many things they think, oh, well, I'd love to do that, but I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to make that elaborate display. I'm quite terrified of hanging plants. Not only just the lack of DIY skills that makes me think they're going to end up on my head smashing down, but also that I find it really difficult to remember to water stuff that's hanging up and inaccessible. So I go down this rabbit hole of looking at Instagram and coming up with all these great ideas and then realising that actually it's easier just to stick with what I've got. That said, the one thing I would really push, and you can't really see it in this picture, but it is true that combinations of different plants in the same pot can be quite fun and a good way of experimenting. So also in this begonia beefsteak, there is pussy ears, which has been taken over. But it was a nice idea when it started to have these furry leaves of that plant trailing with the begonia. And you can just try those different combinations, I think is really fun to see what works. Having ground cover underneath, perhaps your Dracaena marginata, mixing together different colours of something like the Fittonia, the nerve plant, and it comes in different colours. You can make a really fun terrarium or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
and actually, I never like to see compost or any kind of growing media in the top of a pot. So I have something low growing like Fittonia, or I like to mulch with pine cones, or every so often when I clean up my Trachycarpus outside, or that Koya that comes off the stem. That's actually really nice just to mulch the top of a pot rather than looking at compost. And how about you, Anne? Do you have a full planted tea service?
No, although I have used little teacups for putting air plants in and so forth. Fill them with some pebbles or some shells and just balance the air plant in there. That looks quite neat. I have tried putting things together into bigger containers, but I generally find I get the balance wrong, and I'll put something like a Maranta in there, a prayer plant type, and it will just take over and squeeze everything else out. But I think the most fun I have with plants is probably where It's not exactly inside the house. It's a porch where somebody's fitted some old kitchen top units along one side.
Right.
And so that gives me the ability to do a bit of staging. And now staging is something we used to go in for a lot in the old Wisley glass house, and probably less so in the one you have now, because we used to have lots of benches that were gravelled.
Yeah.
And you could do all sorts of wonderful arrangements of plants, so they all juxtaposed, and sometimes you'd raise some up at the back by standing them on upturned pots, and you get all the shapes and sizes together, and I really enjoy doing that in there. And also it helps you when you're sort of constantly rearranging them to dead leaf them and look for pests and just check them over and get them so that they're all sitting nicely with each other, and they're all very happy, sort of living cheek by jowl too. Yeah. That's quite nice. But I get what you're saying about not having bare tops. It's quite nice to grow things in there.
Yeah, and actually when you're talking about your staging, it's about bringing things close together, and then they set each other off. And you don't have gaps, you don't see pots. It can look like a big, quite full-on display.
But it's not so easy to do inside the house. That's more something for, say, a conservatory or a porch where you can set up a surface.
Yeah, where you've got a bit more space. But speaking of the Wisley Glasshouse and what you remember and what you think we might not do or do, we have quite a wacky display coming up that we're calling the Giant Houseplant Takeover, which in our temperate house, we are literally building a small house. You'd be able to walk in through the front doors, walk through the hallway, through into the living room, the bedroom, the kitchen, and it will be like the inhabitants left the house years ago and the plants are literally taking over. So there'll be plants growing out the furniture. We've got a 4-poster bed which has these living pineapple finials that were being planted up the other day when I walked through. We've got this gallery on one of the walls of all succulents planted up in picture frames. It's so cool and fun. The team are having a lot of fun with it. There's a big chessboard and all the chess pieces are actual small cacti. So just to really get people further inspired by houseplants and thinking outside the box a little bit. It's certainly not like the old school tiered displays of the old glass house, which I remember the trailing ivies on the benches and things lined up beautifully in pots of all grown to the same quality. We do still do a bit of that and it's fun. It's great. There's no right or wrong with it. It's just a different way of doing something. There's also a huge stag's horn fern being lowered into a bath the other day when I walked through. So there's loads of really cool things and it's quite light-hearted. And that's running through the entire month of February, so do check that out in the glass house.
I'm really looking forward to seeing that. I'm going to get all over excited as usual and bounce around looking at that. I'm very excited. And I think it's going to be interesting for you to see whether you get a different clientele, a different type of visitor coming to that, because I know when I went to the Houseplant Festival at the Garden Museum last year, it was like a rock concert. There were people queuing for 2 hours to get into that event, and it really made me realise just how much this current houseplant trend is just drawing in a whole new generation of people. So I'm sure it'll be popular.
I keep noticing on the local bus where I am in Fulham, there's a garden centre just down the road, and so many people in their 20s carrying variegated rubber plants, palms, yuccas, literally armfuls of houseplants in and out of that garden centre. It's great.
And is this house your particular brainchild? Or
no, it came up through the Glasshouse team actually.
Did it?
Yeah, we
Good
always
for them.
Yeah, we always have a winter event of some description in the Glasshouse. We like to mix it up. We've done tropical butterflies, we had Lego sculptures, and this kind of evolved. One of the team was talking about having a giant terrarium, and then bit by bit we've got to this idea of having this house. So they've gone from doing these poinsettia towers for the Christmas displays now into planting picture frames, moving baths around, going antique shopping. It's really, really good fun. So it's one of those things that I think maybe an old school perception of the RHS might be quite stuffy and serious, but at the same time it's evolved so much and we can still have really great horticulture and good houseplants, and it can be a bit more tongue-in-cheek. So that opens on the 25th of January and runs till the 1st of March, and the full opening times of the Glasshouse and the garden can be found on the website. Okay, so moving along to plant problems and expert solutions. What are the current plants and problems that are bothering your listeners on both GQT and On the Ledge? Over to Jane.
Oh, well, I mean, I think I've said earlier about, there's always the question about what do I do about this dead stick, which is a fairly simple answer. But also one of the things that is coming up a lot is, where do I get this rare plant that everyone's after and I've seen on Instagram that I must have? And when you say you can't get it, they can't quite compute that, because It's the internet, surely.
Of course,
you can just click
you go
on
to
the
Amazon,
button.
you can get everything tomorrow, right?
Yeah,
What's
so
the problem?
there's this sort of lack of understanding sometimes, or just not awareness of how the lead times that nurseries are working to. It was the case a few years ago with the Chinese money plant, the pancake plant, however we like to describe it, Pilea peperomioides, suddenly went through this explosion of interest.
Didn't it? Massive,
and, I had people on the show saying that they were paying, $50 for a little tiny plant. Now everywhere's caught up. It's being sold mass-produced at places like IKEA and Trader Joe's in the US, which is kind of one of those mass sellers. That demand has been met by the supply, but sometimes people can't accept that, a slow-growing plant like that Bantel Sensation, it's going to take an awfully long time for the supply and demand to be equalised, if that makes sense.
And how about GQT, and what's a regular houseplant conundrum?
Mealybug turns up quite often. People don't always know what it is, and they sometimes mistake it. They think they've got something like woolly aphid on their houseplants. But my heart always sinks because it's just not an easy solution, is it?
There isn't.
Sometimes you can prune out quite a lot of the mealybug-infested growth and try and treat the remainder. It's a little bug that looks like a small, how would you describe it?
A small
sort of
woodlouse.
Woodlouse, really,
white.
sort of pinky white colour. And it surrounds itself with this sort of fuzzy, mealy white material. Small ones creep around, and eventually you see these white blobs on your plants, and they're sucking sap and also flicking honeydew onto lower leaves, so they're beginning to turn black with the growth of sooty mould. So it's not a great thing to have, and sometimes it's better to just cut your losses and get rid of the infected plants and start again. And if you have a really, really lovely houseplant collection, and some plants like the Stapeliads I'm interested in that are very prone to it, and you bring in a new plant, it's often best to put it in quarantine, because within a 2-month period, that could actually sprout something nasty like that would run through your entire rest of collection.
And that's such a good tip. And mealybug, people often say, where did the pest come from? And normally it's chances I had it, you either didn't notice or it was at a very low level. And like you say, 2 months down the line, suddenly it erupts.
Up.
And once you have it, it is just a menace, isn't it?
It's just difficult to get rid of. You can try spraying at it with some of these sort of less toxic sprays, and some of them will work if you keep at it, because you have to spray to break down the coating and then again to actually kill the bug. But the eggs always seem to hatch out, and you have to keep watching and looking. Then you can also get a biological control, which is a sort of ladybird-like creature, but it's not very efficient.
Okay, so to wrap up our houseplant special, I wanted to ask you about future plants, blue sky plant thinking. So if money or location or rarity or anything and everything was available to you, what would your ideal dream plant or plant combination be? Surely a sea of Bantel Sensation, Jane.
Obviously, yes.
Thousands.
It's a difficult one because there's so many options here. One of the options I was thinking of, have you seen that skyscraper in Italy? I think it's called the Bosco Verticale, the skyscraper with all the trees on the balconies.
Yeah.
I like just one of those with trees everywhere and stuff inside. Wouldn't that be amazing to live in one of those apartments? The other option, I think, would just be a really modern greenhouse, or two really modern greenhouses. One as my kind of front of house, where I'd theoretically relax with my absolutely tip-top houseplants, and then another one for kind of production. I'm imagining it looks like, have you ever been to that glass house, the Bombay Sapphire glass house?
I've seen pictures, yeah.
I'm thinking it might look something like that. I'm thinking, two of those, or perhaps a more traditional greenhouse for the back of house, and then, a fancy one. And I could sort of flip between the two.
Sounds like a whole glass house complex. Sounds
Yeah.
beautiful.
And it would have to be separate from my house so that I could go and hide away and my family couldn't find me. And
hide away with plants. That sounds good. That sounds very good. And Anne, you've got some artistic drawings.
Yeah, but I think we're on the same page. Well, having been warned about this question and having had a 3-hour train trip up down from Devon, I was able to do a little sketch. And I didn't know what to sketch. I just thought, just let my imagination flow. I started off drawing my office as it is, which is quite good. Cleared out and decorated, it would be quite good, because it already is like a sort of private space outside in the garden in an old wooden building that's sort of tumbling down a bit. And so I sketched the bench, and there's a little tripod with a huge Phlebodium aureum, which is a kind of golden polypody fern. and loads of rhizomes sticking out from it. And then I added a platycerium, the staghorn fern, on the wall. And then I moved round, and instead of all the sort of rubbish that's all over the furniture, I cleared all that away in my mind, and I made it museum-like with lots of old books and shells and skulls of birds and things like that. And there's a beautiful columnia, a goldfish plant, and then I put in the pothos that has the little silvery marks on its leaves. Scindapsus argyraeus is very in at the moment. And then I had a kind of a conservatory extension that was heated, and I stuck in there a jade vine. So I added one of those and loads of Hoyas and a box of postcards because I collect them. And then I had my terrarium replanted. So there are pictures of knives and forks and spoons on long handles, ready for me to put plants in. And then I drew myself, sort of. I didn't put eyes and nose on because that was a bit weird. I just drew my hair and my face. Then I stuck a little coronet with air plants on it around my head.
Little air plant
So
crown.
that's me. I'm going to grow into a little old lady in a slightly improved office with masses of plants. Oh, and a big map on the wall so I can see all the countries they come from.
Well, both of those are so creative, and they sound like heavenly kind of places of relaxation and gorgeous plants. I was thinking much more low level, and I was just thinking I really want to get my hands on a variegated fiddle leaf fig. The other thing I saw on Instagram, and I don't know if you saw this, my all-time favourite palm is Licuala grandis, which I find impossible because it needs heat and humidity. Look at the variegated.
Oh, my.
I mean, that's like variegation porn at its best, isn't it?
That's amazing.
Goodness knows where you get hold of it, and I bet it would be a nightmare to keep looking like that. The leaves of Licuala grandis are like pleated paper almost,
like
or
fans, aren't they?
Fans of like pleated, or like an old school pleated skirt, and then all these white striations running through it. It's just, when I saw that, I was like, OMG. And it's had, I mean, this was a while ago. It was just gone out on Instagram. It already had over 4,000 likes. And I'm sure it's impossible. But I'd be very happy with one of those. So, conclusion and looking forward, where do we think things are going with houseplants? Do you think it'll be sustained? What do you think is next? All the discussions about environment and just looking after our planet, moving towards, say, peat-free growing houseplants. What's on the horizon, Anne?
I feel that there are so many people getting so passionate about houseplants, they are going to really take to them and want to keep growing them because of the fascination element and not just because they're decorative. Yeah. And I also think that as the natural habitats of a lot of the plants are decreasing, we might end up preserving species because they've made successful houseplants. There are already examples of that. I think Echinocactus grusonii, it's unfortunately called mother-in-law's
seat.
Or seat or something.
Here we go again.
Those mother-in-laws, I don't know.
I
get bad press.
It's unfair, isn't it? Certainly when I was at Kew, that was a red dot plant, which meant that it was endangered in the wild, and yet it's become a really popular sort of landscaping in tropical countries or dry countries, but warmer ones, and also as a house plant, as a cactus in people's collections. Yeah. So its survival is more or less ensured in that respect, isn't it? So in a way, I think we could end up actually conserving plants through keeping them.
Yeah. And Jane?
Well, I mean, I think you touched on sustainability there, and that's something that I've been looking at On the Ledge, because for me, there's lots of awareness now in gardening generally about sustainability, but it hasn't translated quite so much into the houseplant realm as it has elsewhere. And, when you start asking questions about peat and about transport and about use of plastics, there's a lot of blanks when it comes to houseplants, which I've been trying to gradually kind of fill in and find out. If you go and look for a compost which is branded as houseplant compost that's peat-free, that doesn't really exist. You can't really find that. So I've been experimenting with various peat-free options for houseplants, and with quite a lot of success, using just the Silver Grow, which is produced by a company called Melcourt, as a base for different houseplant mixes. That seems to work quite well. But I am hoping that some of the peat-free compost companies will start looking at coming out with a branded houseplant compost, because I think a lot of people buying that stuff for their houseplants won't really be aware of it unless that option is out there. So I think that's something that's really coming to the fore of my mind, and there'll be more transparency. Yeah. So more information about where plants are from, how they've been produced, what their carbon footprint is, just as we are with garden plants. I think that would be really great to see that moving forward. And I'd also love to see propagation becoming something that people are really starting to get excited about, and learning new propagation techniques like air layering, which we were talking about, just so they can really get to that next level of houseplant ownership that comes after you've bought all the lovely plants and seen them grow.
We're out of time now, so thank you to both of you for coming to talk houseplants. I mean, it's been the best hour of my afternoon in a while. I could sit and talk for another couple of hours with you both. And as always, you can find links to more information about all the topics discussed on our programme page at rhs.org.uk/podcast, including a link, of course, to the On the Ledge podcast with Jane Perrone. And please remember to get in touch and tweet us your passion for houseplants. And finally, if you have time, please do rate and review our podcasts. It really helps other people who love plants to find us and share knowledge and their love of gardening. So thank you very much, ladies. I hope you've had a good afternoon. Happy houseplanting.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Well, that's it for this week's show. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Matthew and Anne. Do check out the RHS podcast. And if you're an RHS podcast subscriber who's popped over to check out On the Ledge, welcome. I hope you'll come and stay a while. Until next week, my friends, stay leafy. Bye. The music in this week's episode was Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, Whistle by Benjamin Banger, and Endeavour by Jazar, all licensed under Creative Commons. See janeperrone.com for details.